Hello, my name is Thomas, and thank you very much for downloading this episode of British Culture, Albion Never Dies. My previous episode, entitled The Next Prime Minister, got quite a lot of feedback, so this episode is all about the listener questions that I received and my best answers that I can give right now. So I hope you enjoy this episode. As I say, it's based on the 10 questions that I selected as being, well, just the most interesting for this podcast. Before I get underway, I'd just like to say thank you very much to everybody who gave me a 5-star review on iTunes. So I'd just like to shout out to Alex Lammas and Mr. Quantum of History and Donny Waldron, both of whom gave me just really glowing reviews. For some reason it says on the iTunes that they gave me these reviews a little while ago, but for some reason they've just started displaying now. I've seen them. Thank you so much. Again, these reviews really help people find this podcast, and when people are looking around for what to download, as I say, it can really, really help. So if you haven't given this podcast a 5-star review, I'm not saying you have to, but it would help people find it. Thank you also very much to Daniel Gaster, who pointed out I misspoke in my previous episode. I was talking about the murder of Sir David Amess, who was stabbed at his surgery when a member of Parliament goes to meet members of the general public, and I said that it was in 2001. It wasn't. It was in 2021, as it was in my notes. I can now understand all the old people saying, 20 years ago feels like only yesterday. It does. I know I did that in conversation a little while ago, but yeah, it was just last year that Sir David Amess, as I say, was stabbed by an Islamic State sympathiser, fanatic. And again, creating this review into MP security and ultimately leading to the decision that it was still vital to our democracy that members of Parliament should be accessible to members of the public. The democratic need outweighed the one terrible, terrible instance. Again, thank you very much to Daniel Gaster for pointing that out, because these little errors can creep in easily. We can all do it, and it's really helpful to me to hear that. I do like to read out all the corrections, so if you hear something that's not quite right, it could be just that I misspoke. Please do send me a message, especially to my Fleming Never Dies Instagram account. Okay, without further ado, we shall get to the 10 questions. The number one, first person to message me, Izzy Reddy Goes Bond on Instagram, who just asked, how is Brexit going? Did it work? As you may know, there was a referendum in 2016 under the Prime Minister David Cameron into whether we should stay in the EU, remain, or whether we should Brexit, Britain's exit from the EU. Leave got 17 million votes, 410,742, whilst Remain got 16,000, 141,241. So that was 51.89% to Leave, with only 48.11% to Remain. That triggered David Cameron's resignation. He led the campaign to stay in the EU, along with most of the front cabinet, the front bench. But it was a very, very divided and divisive referendum. We joined the common market back in 1973, and in 75 we'd had a referendum as to whether we should remain a member of that common market. About 67.2% of the votes cast were in favour then of Britain remaining in the common market back then. Anyway, so we were in the EU, or the common market, or the European Economic Community, for a fair few years. Leaving it is, of course, complex, because it's trading, it's regulation, there's a great deal entwined. Red tape binds us all together. Negotiations started under Prime Minister Theresa May, who stepped up following David Cameron's resignation, and as she failed to reach an agreement with her MPs, we then had Boris Johnson, who campaigned on Get Brexit Done, and ultimately, on 21st of January 2020, the House of Lords passed the Brexit bill, initially after approving 5 amendments to it, but then these amendments were overturned by the House of Commons on the following day. So on the 22nd of January 2022, the bill was passed by the House of Lords without further modifications. Then on the 23rd of January, it received royal assent. In other words, it became law. There were no longer members of the EU. This whole debate has dominated the British political agenda since 2016. Of course, at that time I was not living in the UK. I was aware through media, but also through Facebook. I've never seen a political issue that proved so divisive with people of all ages, all incomes, all education levels, or all other political thinking. It rarely seemed to cut across any kind of normal political line. It wasn't left or right or authoritarian or free or whatever normal boundaries you might have. It didn't divide along normal party lines either. Ultimately it came to really a question of identity. What do you see as British identity, and what do you see as the ideal British identity? I haven't really covered it, which is perhaps interesting because this podcast asks what is Britishness, and that was a big part of the debate. To be honest, I started after it was all really water under the bridge, and nobody has ever really requested it until now. So it is an interesting one. It did dominate, but of course since then the world has moved on. We've dealt with COVID-19 and many other great issues, to the point that one of the front runners to become the next Prime Minister, Liz Truss, she campaigned against Brexit, but then was a minister in the Brexit cabinet and is supported by some of the most hardline Brexiteers. So now it seems events have moved on enough that that division is in the past. That was question number 1. Question number 2 was from the Tiki Bond on Instagram, who asked, is there anything like a libertarian party there? I believe he's based in the US. I was surprised. I thought I'd quickly Google it just before I answered him. Yeah, there is a Libertarian Party in the UK, LP UK. It's never gained even 1% of the vote at an election, not nationally, but in the constituencies where they stand. So a general election in the UK, as I explained in the last episode, is essentially 650 simultaneous elections, each for the 650 constituencies, the electing regions of the UK. So you have an MP for, your area. And so even in those small areas, they've never gained that much. Their party membership is at the moment 1,000, according to themselves, which is compared to the Conservatives, who don't release what their membership is. But the last time they had a leadership election, around 160,000 people voted. There's a big discrepancy, as you can see in the numbers. So yes, there is a Libertarian Party in the UK. I follow politics to a degree, but I was greatly surprised to discover we even have one. In fact, one of the leading lights of that party described taking part in elections as a waste of time. They prefer to be some kind of pressure group on the other parties. A very interesting question. Number 3 is from Daniel Gaster, who of course you may be very familiar with. Daniel Gaster on Instagram, and he also writes great articles for the From Tailors of Love blog. I get rarely into them. The ones I enjoy the most are where he'll take an item that James Bond wore, he'll buy the exact same thing, wear it for 10 years, especially for the blog, and then write how well it held up. I really enjoy those articles on whether these items are a good long-term investment. Anyway, for this podcast, Daniel Gaster asked, how could politics be made more interesting, especially for young people? This was a big question back in the 2010s, and it was thought, by David Cameron, that maybe greater involvement with actual decision-making would benefit. So that's why we had 3 referendums under Cameron, one on the voting methods, one on Scottish independence, and one on the EU. But ultimately, it seemed to create this kind of voter fatigue. By the time Theresa May called an earlier election, there was a lady interviewed on the street who said, "Oh no, another one? Oh, it's all too much." And that did seem to sum up the general attitude of the country. I think Theresa May was kind of punished at the ballot box for holding an early election after so many kind of referendums and so on going on. So yeah, that doesn't seem to be it. For a long time, TV debates was thought to be one way. So the United States has these, these presidential debates that are renowned, but we didn't have them until 2015. It often had been considered, so the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition would sometimes suggest they do one, and normally whoever thought they'd come off better would suggest it, and the other one would say, no thank you. But we do have regular debates. They do regularly clash, and we see it in Parliament every Wednesday. The Prime Minister must answer questions from MPs. Those on the opposite benches, of course, pretty hostile. Sometimes he'll get a friendly question from his own side, but it is a very, very lively debate that we have. And for me, when I've watched the American presidential elections, it does seem a lot more sedate. One man has a speech, another man has a speech. it goes kind of back and forth with the moderator, compared to Prime Minister's Question Time, which is referred to as the bear pit. It is very, very different. Incidentally, someone I know went to American stand-up, comedy club, and was instructed not to call out, not her specifically, the whole audience was instructed not to call out to the performers. No heckling. Someone who's too loud was told off, which I found really, really interesting and very curious. About 30% of people who listen to this podcast are from the United States, so if you are American and you've been to a stand-up comedy club, let me know, because of course a great feature of British stand-up is that there are hecklers and you get to see the responses. That's the biggest danger. You can heckle a British comedian as much as you like. The problem is they're a professional and they will reply. Again, does seem to be some big difference. I always notice the difference in deference Americans give to a president compared to what we would say to a prime minister, because of course we have our royal family where we might defer to them, but not to a prime minister. He is one of the commons. There's also a difference in what ex-prime ministers do compared to ex-presidents. Again, ex-presidents seem to have a lot going on. British prime minister, I mean, you've done your bit. Goodbye. Anyway, Daniel Gaster's question was about how to make politics more interesting, especially for young people. Perhaps if your vote looks like it will have an impact and will actually change something you can see, then that will get young people involved. But then again, Spike Milligan used to say, one day you'll wake up and the don't knows will have won. So, if I could answer that question better, well, maybe I should be the next Prime Minister, but I won't be. Question number 4 was from Charloyd, 0926 on Instagram. Thank you very much for messaging me. But a great question, does the monarch have a role in politics? Well, I mean, constitutionally, of course. I mean, she appoints the Prime Minister, laws are passed by her, they get royal assent, that's when they become laws. The ministers serve the Queen, not the Prime Minister, as do the civil service. Of course, there's always the question of how much power she actually has. She is one of Britain's best informed people. She has the right to see all documents that are written in her name. She doesn't even need to have a driving licence, because of course you only need a driving licence in the UK to drive on the Queen's Road, and they're her roads, so she doesn't need a licence from herself. But her real role, I would say, is in unifying the nation. So for example, her COVID broadcast, a lot of political issues surround that naturally, but her broadcast really did help bring people together, and is well worth checking out if you want to see what her role is. It's so delicately written and so fantastically delivered. And of course there's her Christmas broadcast, which I always enjoy, and she reflects on the year. I'd say it gets into kind of government by consensus. She brings people together. She makes sure the right people are in the right place. As head of the Church of England, she is supreme governor of the Church of England, as all monarchs have since the Act of Supremacy, 1558. But again, it's not like she goes in sacking individual vicars and priests, but nonetheless, she is able to bring people together. Tend to be on their best behaviour when she's there. Arguments tend to cool down as they're all respectful in her presence. Anyway, I think that's her main role, bringing people together so we can all agree and move forwards. Question number 5 is from Matt Spacer of bondsuits.com, who asked, is it possible to draw parallels to US politics? There are connections. So for example, Penny Mordaunt, who was the third most popular Prime Ministerial candidate in the recent shuffle, and has been knocked out now of the race. There's only 2. But she had actually worked for George W. Bush's election campaign. So there you do get a direct connection. Does that mean that she thinks George W. Bush's policies are fantastic for England? Not necessarily. Not all things that work in the US can work in the UK, because we just have different cultural preferences. Our politics can sometimes seem similar, but I'd say our general public is where the difference really lies. We've seen failed US imports. So for example, US style conventions, which are often kind of celebrations of your candidate. Neil Kinnock tried that, I think that was back in 1992, and was just failed. It looked weird. It looked smug, many people would say, and he was punished again at the ballot box. Negative campaigning. US, does have a history of these attack ads, which we don't really have in the UK. And I found it really interesting to watch the US ones, because it doesn't work here. Even a relatively mild attack campaign relative to the US that was run in 1997 by the Conservatives backfired horribly. Basically, whoever campaigns negatively will get the negative response. And for a long time, TV debates just didn't work. But if you look at the real business of government, what do governments do? Raise taxes, spend taxes, exercise sovereign rights. What are the similarities and differences? Well, in the UK, taxation is around 39% of GDP, maybe a bit less depending how you calculate it. In the US, it's 25%. There's just different expectations of taxation and what you get out of it. Of course, in France, it's 45%. Of course, in Mexico, it's just 16%. So you get very different preferences, what people want from a government, what they want to give. And of course, with taxation, how you get it. Think of when I bought one of my favourite hats. I bought when I was on holiday in the US. I saw the price on it and I thought, you know what, it's a bit expensive, but I'm willing to pay it. And then I took it to the till, and of course they add on tax at the till rather than listing it on the item. So I ended up paying, I think it was $100. I have a $100 hat. I did not expect to be buying a $100 hat. Too late to pull out. Because in the UK, it's all national, so whatever the price is on a product, that's what you pay at the till. And then, of course, there's federal taxes, local taxes. We have very different attitudes just towards taxation. Although no taxation without representation was, of course, a cry during the English Civil War, so we do have some similarities. Spending taxes, again, we'd rather pay more because we have very specific ideas about healthcare and welfare that are very, very different. So David Lloyd George, whose statue I saw outside Parliament just recently, said after World War I, "What is our task? To make Britain a fit country for heroes to live in." So again, very different attitudes about what we should be getting. I think that gets into the earlier question about whether we'd have a libertarian party. And then, of course, the third part of government is exercising sovereign rights, the government flexing its power. I sometimes see that on the international stage, but it's interesting to study at the domestic stage. Again, during COVID, I was in China for the first stage of that. That was interesting, seeing how the government responded to the crisis. Then I went to the US, which had a totally different conception of how to run it. And then I came to the UK, where, again, a third, very different way of dealing with it. And of course I watch reports from Turkey. I speak Turkish, I'll read the newspapers, and there's a very different attitude there. It gets into what people want, what they want from a government, what they're willing to pay, how they want it to happen. So is it possible to draw parallels to US politics? In very general terms, often yes. But when you get down to the specific policy or how a population might respond, it would be very, very, very different. Even questions like what is a conservative and what would conservatives put through. So, for example, it was the UK Conservative government that put through gay marriage. That would probably not happen in the US. I say, on the edge of my ignorance of US politics, but I don't imagine it. So again, there are very distinct differences, because if you are a conservative, you're conserving what's good about your country and changing what's not. And of course, what's good about different countries will naturally be different. Question number 6 came from nslayton5 on Instagram, who asked me, do you believe the reports of the coup plot against Harold Wilson? This is a very specific question, a really interesting one. One of these alleged coup plots happened in 1974, so I thought, first of all, the past is a different country. I thought I'd have a look at what was going on then. So of course, mid-1974, you've got the threat of war between two NATO allies, Turkey and Greece, and this was over the Cyprus issue. We've got the two communities on the island, the Turkish minority and the Greek majority, but they are two very separate communities, and of course the communal fighting had gotten worse and worse, and then Greece sponsored a coup attempt on the island, which went, I would say, very badly wrong for everybody involved. The tensions were so high that when Turkey sent in troops to protect the Turkish minority, their top fighter pilots were not sent on this major operation in the Mediterranean. Their top fighter pilots were on the border with Greece in case something happened. Greece at this time, of course, was under the junta of the 5 colonels. So again, a very tense time, being watched very carefully by the USSR, seeing this conflict between the two NATO allies. And of course, NATO at that time, if it was not only headed by the US, you had Nixon as president, who was mired in the Watergate scandal and would shortly be impeached. Whilst over in East Asia, you have the end, really, of the Vietnam War as communist forces continue to drive forward on land, and of course the Chinese Navy at sea. You'd get the fall of Saigon, as the Americans call it, the following year. Whilst in the UK, what was going on? Well, from the 1st of January to the 7th of March, you have the legendary 3-day week introduced as a measure to conserve electricity during that period of industrial action by coal miners. Then, of course, you have that political ramification, tense political changes, the National Front gaining more than 10% of the vote in several parts of London in council elections, not getting any councillors, but gaining huge numbers of supporters, the National Front being a very far right-wing extremist party. And of course you've got the tensions in Northern Ireland leading to a series of bombing campaigns on the mainland. So what was going on? Lots and lots and lots. So were there people suggesting that Harold Wilson should be removed? Were there rumours going around that he was a Soviet spy? Was he right to be paranoid, or is paranoia perfectly justified if it turns out that your fears are true? Who knows? For me, it's so far in the past. Again, I understand, for some people it might feel like just yesterday, but I cannot possibly answer. What I should add is, because I was looking into what was going on back then, that it was not all bad. ABBA won the Eurovision Song Contest with Waterloo. The movie The Man with the Golden Gun came out, as did John le Carré's novel Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. So some fantastic things going on. And as for menswear fashion, well, I'm sure 1974 marks the high point in history of menswear. So again, I don't feel I have a solid answer to it, except it was a very different time. Okay, Major Talon, my 7th question, asked, who do you prefer out of Sunak and Truss as the UK's next Prime Minister? It's only 2 now, 2 candidates that are being put out to the Conservative Party membership. The ballot will close at 5 p.m. on Friday, 2nd of September. Ballots received after that time won't be counted. The leader will be announced Monday, the 5th of September. The winner will become the leader of the Conservative Party, and because they have the largest number of members of Parliament, then that will be our next Prime Minister. So who can vote? Well, Conservative Party members who've been members for at least 3 months immediately prior to the close of the ballot. So only current members who joined on or before the 3rd of June 2022. So who do I prefer? In one sense, it doesn't matter. I have as much voting right as the man in the street in Libya, or as many of my listeners around the world. So I cannot vote, it doesn't matter. But who would I choose if I could? Well, for me, I would watch the debates. There's more debates coming. I'm sure there'll be plenty playing out in the newspapers and on live TV debates. They will go head-to-head again. Their clashes were very interesting, quite informative, I think, last time. I'm looking forward to seeing more of them and getting more of an insight into Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. One of them will be the next Prime Minister. As I say, it will be determined by about 160,000 members of the Conservative Party as they vote. Okay, a fun cultural question, number 8, from Adam John Fraser, said, is Thatcher the only Prime Minister to appear in a Bond film? Yes, of course, she appeared in For Your Eyes Only. Initially just referred to, British Defence Minister Sir Frederick Grey says in the film, she'll have our guts for garters. There's no M in this film due to Bernard Lee's passing during filming. And it's also, this film is the only time we see a Prime Minister's husband in the Bond films. He's played by John Wells, and there couldn't be a better person to play Dennis Thatcher. He's the co-author of the Dear Bill books and the stage play Anyone for Dennis. Dear Bill, fantastic satirical books, as if they were written by Dennis Thatcher to one of his friends, Bill, and he has his curious view of events as he pops into the kitchen and hears things from his wife, Margaret, about how the country's being run. It's a satirical series of books. They're highly entertaining, and John Wells, of course, played Dennis Thatcher, not just in the film, but in his own stage play. John Wells was also an early contributor to Private Eye magazine, then being edited by his co-author, Richard Ingrams, who had later found the Oldie magazine. Just a fun bit of trivia. The stage play, Anyone for Dennis, in its initial run, had Roy Kinnear, the father of Rory Kinnear, who plays Tanner, for a long time. Of course, Rory Kinnear avoided comic roles to avoid kind of too close a comparison to his father. He's really good at them and really good at playing Tanner. Anyway, I'm talking about Dennis Thatcher, played by John Wells. Margaret Thatcher was played by Janet Brown, who was a renowned Thatcher impersonator. There were quite a few at the time, including another Mrs. Brown. But Janet Brown wrote her autobiography and entitled it Prime Miniker. Interesting, that came out in 1986. Of course, Margaret Thatcher would carry on being Prime Minister for several years afterwards. So yes, Margaret Thatcher is the only Prime Minister to appear in a Bond film. That's a good one. Question number 9 from Daniel Carroll, number 4 on Instagram. I was surprised at this. I misread it the first time. I thought he said, who's your favourite post-1940 PM? I thought 1940. Who's your favourite pre-1940 PM? So, yeah, I was really, really interested in that. Most people always ask, since the Second World War, who's your favourite one before the Battle of Britain? Just off the top of my head, I thought Disraeli and Gladstone. Then I thought a bit more. I thought maybe Lord Palmerston, the Duke of Wellington as well. And that would be my recommended rabbit hole for this episode. The Duke of Wellington, who of course commanded at the Battle of Waterloo. But have a look before his European career. Have a look into what he did in India. And have a look at his career as a Prime Minister. He led a very interesting life. And movies, TV tends to focus on one aspect of it. The fella did a lot. So, for example, he was asked to comment on a famous divorce case in which a gang demanded that he should declare loyalty for Caroline of Brunswick, and she was then queen, and the king was seeking a divorce. And as the Duke of Wellington's carriage was besieged, he reportedly leaned out and said, "God save the Queen, and may all your wives be like her." Worth looking into. Duke of Wellington, recommended rabbit hole. My final question I have a short answer to. It's from GoldenEye Forever, who said, have you heard about Sunak's wife businesses? Well, of course, Rishi Sunak has been a chancellor. He's married the daughter of an Indian billionaire. This has been much commented in the media for all their business interests. And I suspect over the next few days, weeks, we're going to hear a lot more about it. So I'm not going to comment at the moment, as I suspect events will overtake anything I say very, very rapidly. I shall leave it there. That was my last question number 10. So I did have a few more messages that I just thought I'd talk about. One from Purdy, who you may have heard on the podcast Quantum of History. The helicopter pilot gave a great insight into, his life, and gave us some insight into what we see in the Bond films too. But we had a flurry of messages and ended up talking about Private Eye magazine, which I mentioned earlier. I really love Private Eye magazine. I haven't really found anything in any other country that's quite the same. It is a satirical magazine, but it also has serious investigation. That's unusual. So some people might look at the cover and think it's a bit like, say, Mad magazine, or a bit like the National Enquirer in the US. But in fact, it has deep, deep research. It's often a trailblazer in uncovering political scandals. To get away with some of what it publishes, it does have a series of euphemisms, and this euphemism acts as a kind of code protecting them from libel laws. The current editor, Ian Hislop, has been in front of judges many, many, many times over libel. Defended himself pretty well in most cases. So they will use phrases such as tired and emotional. Tired and emotional means drunk. It has been used, originally it appeared in a parody memo supposedly informing civil servants as to how to describe the Labour Party cabinet minister and deputy leader George Brown, who was an alcoholic. So they were told to describe him as tired and emotional. So if you're drunk, you're just tired and emotional. One of the popular ones is Arkle versus Prestram. Private Eye had covered a case of Mr. J. Arkle, who Private Eye magazine accused of receiving kickbacks from a debt collection agency in his role as retail credit manager at Granada Group. So Mr. Arkle's lawyers wrote a letter which concluded, quote, his attitude to damages will be governed by the nature of your reply. This is really unusual. You don't do that. Either you sue for libel or you don't. Print will be damned. So the magazine responded, we acknowledge your letter of 29th April referring to Mr. J. Arkle. We note that Mr. Arkell's attitude to damages will be governed by the nature of our reply, and would therefore be grateful if you would inform us what his attitude to damages would be were he to learn that the nature of our reply is as follows. F off. So, when Private Eye refers to language as used in the Arkell versus Prestram case, this is what they're referring to. There'll also be a number of other jokes. The number 94 in itself is used for comedic purposes for whatever arcane origins as a generic, large number. So if something's too long and boring, they'll refer to, he went on for 94 more minutes, or he went on for 90 more pages of transcript. For more details, see page 94, which of course in Private Eye doesn't exist. They'll also have a number of other euphemisms. For a long time, the Tony Blair Faith Foundation was simply known as Drawing All Faiths Together, which is abbreviated to DAFT. And finally, the Guardian newspaper is generally referred to as the Graniad, which is in reference to the paper's terrible reputation for typographical errors and mistakes. The Guardian, of course, has frequently criticised the Bond series, and it was notable, I think it's in Casino Royale, when there's a newspaper criticising the 00 section, it is the Guardian, which is leading with a scandal in the British spy agency. Bond shooting up an embassy. That is my final fact. I'd just like to say thank you very much to the Bond Experience for sharing on his stories, that this is one of the best and most educational podcasts I've ever heard, specifically about the last episode, The Next Prime Minister. So, sir, thank you very, very much. Niven Taylors was talking about the campaign to become the next Prime Minister of the UK, and he said, quote, "It's a nightmare I can't wake up from." So, didn't suit everyone. Thank you very much for listening. If you'd like to leave a 5-star review, please do on whatever app you listen on. Thank you very much to those who already have. Thank you. Goodbye.